The administrator's words hung like poison in sterile air. Dr. Samuel Whitaker stood in the fluorescent corridor of Memorial General Hospital, staring at Mr. Cross, whose cold eyes reflected nothing but calculated indifference. Outside room 347, Harold lay unconscious, his weathered body fighting for survival while bureaucracy signed his termination papers. The order was clear. Withdraw treatment, let the homeless man fade, make room for someone whose insurance could fund the new wing. Let the patient die, the administrator ordered, would become the headline that exposed everything rotten beneath the white coats and marble floors. But first, Samuel had to make a choice that would strip away his career like skin from bone. Bleh. The fluorescent lights of Memorial General Hospital hummed their endless mechanical prayer, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that erased personality and replaced it with protocol. Dr. Samuel Whitaker had walked these corridors for 23 years, his footsteps tracing patterns of routine so deep they had worn grooves into his soul, each shift blending into the next until time became measured not in hours, but in heartbeats saved and lives extended. He knew every corner of this place, every squeak in the third-floor hallway, every temperamental elevator button, every coffee stain on the break room counter that housekeeping had long ago given up trying to remove. This hospital had been his cathedral, his purpose, the place where his hands had learned to steady themselves against the chaos of trauma and the weight of impossible decisions. But on this October evening, as autumn rain streaked the windows and cast moving shadows across the linoleum, Samuel would learn that even sanctuaries can become chambers of betrayal, that the institutions we devote ourselves to can demand sacrifices that turn healers into executioners. Mr. Richard Cross stood in the administrative corridor with the bearing of a man who had long ago replaced his spine with a quarterly earnings report, his expensive suit fitting him like armor, designed to deflect empathy rather than arrows. At 50 years old, he possessed the kind of face that corporate boards loved. Sharp angles, calculated expressions, eyes that could look at a human being and see only numbers scrolling across a balance sheet. He had been hospital administrator for 7 years, arriving with promises of modernization and efficiency, words that sounded noble in boardroom presentations but translated into something far colder in the actual practice of medicine. Under his leadership, Memorial General had become profitable in ways that made investors smile and made the veteran staff increasingly uncomfortable, though few dared to voice their concerns loud enough to reach the top floor. Cross ran the hospital like a business, which technically it was, but somewhere in that transition from healing center to profit engine, something essential had been lost, some invisible line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Samuel had been reviewing Harold's chart when Cross appeared in the doorway of the doctor's station, his presence immediately changing the temperature of the room. Harold Peterson, 65 years old, homeless for the past 8 years, had been brought in 3 days earlier by paramedics who found him collapsed outside a convenience store, his body shutting down from a combination of untreated diabetes, severe infection, and malnutrition that had reduced him to little more than bones wrapped in weathered skin. The medical team had stabilized him, but he needed surgery, a relatively straightforward procedure to address the infection and repair damage that, if left untreated, would certainly end his life within days. Samuel had scheduled the operation for the following morning, had already reviewed the surgical approach, had spoken with the anesthesiologist, and assembled his team. It should have been routine, the kind of life-saving intervention that justified every grueling year of medical school, every sleepless residency shift, every moment of doubt about whether this profession was sustainable. Cross closed the door behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam, his movements deliberate and rehearsed, as though he had practiced this conversation in front of a mirror. "Dr. Whitaker," "We need to discuss the patient in room 347, he began, his voice carrying that particular smoothness that powerful men cultivate when they are about to say something unconscionable and want it to sound reasonable. Samuel looked up from the chart, already feeling something cold settling into his stomach. Some instinct that had been honed over decades of emergency medicine, warning him that whatever came next would require the kind of strength that had nothing to do with surgical skill. Cross continued without waiting for a response, his words emerging with practiced efficiency, each syllable precisely calibrated to sound like logic rather than cruelty. "Mr. Peterson's surgery needs to be postponed indefinitely. We have a priority admission coming in tomorrow morning. Marcus Bentley, one of our major donors, needs a bed for an elective procedure, and given his contributions to the new cardiac wing, we need to accommodate him immediately." The words hung in the air between them like a toxic gas, invisible but suffocating, and Samuel felt his grip tighten on the edge of the desk as his mind struggled to process what he was actually hearing. This was not a request about scheduling conflicts or resource allocation. This was something far more sinister dressed up in administrative language. Harold was not being postponed to a different surgical slot. He was being condemned to make room for someone whose bank account outweighed his beating heart. Samuel's voice came out steadier than he felt, years of professional composure holding him together even as something fundamental was cracking inside. "Harold Peterson will be gone within 72 hours without that surgery. You are not asking me to postpone treatment. You are asking me to let him pass away." Cross did not flinch, did not even have the decency to look uncomfortable with the translation of his euphemisms into plain truth. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks with a gesture that suggested this conversation was taking longer than he had allocated for it in his schedule. "Dr. Whitaker, let me be direct since you prefer clarity," Cross said, stepping closer to the desk, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow both confidential and threatening. "Mr. Peterson is a homeless individual with no insurance, no family, no one who will ask questions about his care or lack thereof. Marcus Bentley, on the other hand, is on the board of directors, has donated millions to this hospital, and his continued support is essential for our expansion plans. This is not personal. This is practical resource management. You have been in medicine long enough to understand that we cannot save everyone, that difficult choices must be made, that idealism does not keep hospitals running." Samuel stood slowly, his chair rolling back against the wall, his full height rising as though his body was physically rejecting what his ears were being forced to hear. Everything he had believed about this institution, about the profession he had devoted his adult life to, about the fundamental promise that within these walls every human being received equal consideration regardless of their social standing. All of it was being revealed as a comfortable fiction that crumbled the moment it became inconvenient for the balance sheet. The rain outside had intensified, drops hammering against the windows with a violence that matched the storm building inside Samuel's chest, and for a long moment he could not speak, could only stand there, while 2 decades of accumulated faith in medical institutions hemorrhaged out through a wound he had not realized existed until Cross had opened it with such casual precision. His mind raced through 1,000 responses, 1,000 arguments about ethics and oaths and the fundamental compact between healer and patient. But every potential sentence died before reaching his lips because he was beginning to understand that Cross was not confused about the morality of what he was demanding. He simply did not care. This was not ignorance that could be educated away. This was a different value system entirely, one where human lives existed on a hierarchy determined by economic utility, where the worth of a person could be calculated in dollars and their death could be justified as a necessary business decision. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he placed them flat on the desk, trying to ground himself in something solid while everything he had believed about his profession shifted beneath him. "You are asking me to commit medical abandonment," Samuel finally said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that his colleagues would not have recognized. The careful bedside manner stripped away to reveal something far more primal underneath. "You are asking me to violate every principle of medical ethics, to break the oath I took, to let a man pass away, not because medicine cannot save him, but because his life has been deemed financially inconvenient." Cross sighed with theatrical patience, the kind of exaggerated forbearance that powerful people use when they believe they are dealing with someone who is being deliberately obtuse. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document, laying it on the desk between them with the air of someone presenting irrefutable evidence. It was Harold's admission paperwork, and Cross tapped a section near the bottom where, in small print among dozens of other clauses, the hospital had included liability waivers that essentially gave the administration discretion over treatment priorities in cases of resource scarcity. "Everything we are doing is within our legal rights," Cross explained, his tone shifting into something almost professorial, as though he were patiently explaining basic economics to a child who insisted on believing in fairy tales. "The hospital has the authority to make triage decisions based on medical urgency and resource availability. Mr. Bentley's procedure, while elective, is time-sensitive given his schedule, and his continued relationship with this institution serves the greater good by enabling us to provide care for thousands of other patients through his financial support. One life weighed against the many lives his donations will save. The mathematics are quite clear." Samuel stared at the document without touching it, as though physical contact might contaminate him with the kind of moral compromise it represented. He had signed similar forms himself hundreds of times, patient intake documents that everyone treated as mere bureaucratic necessity, never imagining that buried within the legal language were clauses that could be weaponized to justify letting human beings fade away because they lacked the proper insurance codes. The hospital around them continued its normal rhythm, monitors beeping in distant rooms, nurses moving through their rounds, the elevator chiming as it arrived on the floor, all of it continuing as though the world had not just revealed itself to be fundamentally different than Samuel had believed for his entire career. He thought about Harold lying in room 347, probably unconscious right now, his weathered body fighting battles on multiple fronts, while completely unaware that the greatest threat to his survival was not his medical condition, but an administrative decision made in a comfortable office far removed from the smell of antiseptic and the sound of labored breathing. Harold had lived a hard life. That much was clear from his chart and the state of his body when he arrived. Years on the streets, substance struggles he had never fully conquered, a series of choices and circumstances that had gradually stripped away everything except the bare fact of his continued existence. But he was still a person, still someone whose heart pumped blood and whose neurons fired thoughts and whose body was trying desperately to heal itself if only medicine would give it the chance. Samuel's career flashed through his mind in a rapid sequence of remembered faces, patients he had saved, families he had consoled, colleagues he had mentored, all of it building toward this single moment where he had to decide what kind of doctor he actually was beneath all the credentials and reputation. He had always told himself that he went into medicine for the right reasons, that unlike some of his more mercenary colleagues, he genuinely cared about healing rather than status or income, that he would be the kind of physician who treated every patient with equal dedication, regardless of their ability to pay. But those had been abstract principles, easy to maintain when they were never truly tested, when the system generally worked well enough that he could practice good medicine without having to sacrifice anything significant. Now Cross was offering him a choice that would determine whether those principles were genuine convictions or just comfortable self-deceptions. He had told himself to feel morally superior while operating within a fundamentally compromised system. "I want you to think very carefully about what you are considering," Cross said, his voice taking on a harder edge now that he sensed Samuel's resistance was not going to dissolve under reasonable-sounding arguments. "You have built an excellent career here, Dr. Whitaker. You are respected, well compensated, up for department head next year. Your pension is substantial. Your reputation in this city is sterling. All of that can continue. You simply need to accept that sometimes the greater good requires difficult compromises, that idealism must occasionally yield to practical necessity." The unspoken threat was clear in every word. The suggestion that defiance would come at a cost that extended far beyond this single decision. Samuel would not just be saving Harold. He would be declaring war against the institutional power structure that controlled his professional future, that held his career in hands that had just demonstrated their willingness to let human beings disappear for the sake of profit margins and donor relationships. Samuel walked past Cross without another word, leaving the administrator standing in the doctor's station with his legal documents and his calculated arguments, and moved through the corridor toward room 347, with steps that felt both impossibly heavy and strangely light, as though he was simultaneously bearing the weight of an impossible decision and floating free of constraints that had held him down for years without him fully realizing it. The night shift nurses looked up as he passed, sensing something different in his bearing, some transformation that had occurred in the past few minutes that was visible, even if they could not name it. He reached Harold's room and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the old man's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, his weathered face peaceful in unconsciousness, completely unaware that his life had become the focal point of a battle between medicine and commerce, between human dignity and institutional expedience. Harold looked smaller than he had 3 days ago when the paramedics brought him in, as though his body was gradually collapsing inward under the weight of untreated conditions and accumulated neglect. His hair was thin and grey, his skin marked with the particular damage that comes from years of exposure to weather and deprivation, his hands scarred and calloused in ways that told stories of hard labor and harder living. Samuel had reviewed his limited medical history, sporadic emergency room visits over the years, each one documenting another crisis addressed just enough to keep him alive before sending him back to the streets. A pattern of minimal intervention that had allowed problems to compound until they reached this critical threshold. There were notations in the file from social workers who had tried to connect him with services, mental health professionals who had attempted interventions, a trail of well-meaning efforts that had never quite been sufficient to pull Harold out of the cycle of homelessness and decline. But none of that changed the fundamental fact that right now, in this moment, Harold Peterson's life could be saved with relatively straightforward medical intervention, that the surgery Samuel had scheduled for tomorrow morning had a high probability of success, that with proper post-operative care and some coordination with social services, Harold could walk out of this hospital alive and have years ahead of him. It would not be an easy recovery. He would need ongoing medical management, support with housing and nutrition, help addressing the underlying issues that had led to his current state. But it was possible, achievable, within the scope of what modern medicine could accomplish if it chose to direct its considerable resources toward healing rather than profit. Samuel placed his hand on the doorframe, his fingers pressing against the cold metal as though trying to physically anchor himself against the tide of pressure that was trying to sweep him toward compliance with Cross's order. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Cross, sent from somewhere in the building, its brevity making the threat even more explicit. Decision needs to be made tonight. Bentley arrives at 8 a.m. Your cooperation will be noted in your file. Samuel deleted the message without responding, but its words hung in his mind like hooks, catching on every fear and doubt he had cultivated over 2 decades of career building. What Cross was offering was not just permission to abandon Harold, it was absolution, a framework that would allow Samuel to make the expedient choice while telling himself he was serving a greater good, that he was being realistic rather than cruel, that sometimes hard decisions required setting aside sentiment for practical necessity. It was the same logic that had allowed countless atrocities throughout history, the same moral flexibility that enabled good people to participate in systemic evil while maintaining their self-image as decent and rational actors. Samuel thought about his daughter, Maya, who was in her first year of medical school, full of the same idealistic fire that had driven him into this profession decades ago. She talked about medicine the way he used to, before the endless grind of bureaucracy and insurance battles and administrative interference had worn down his edges, before he had learned to pick his battles and accept compromises in service of remaining functional within a broken system. What would he tell her if she asked his advice about a situation like this? Would he counsel pragmatism, warn her about the cost of defiance? Tell her that idealism was a luxury that practicing physicians could not afford? Or would he tell her the truth, that if you compromise on the fundamental principle that every human life has equal value, then everything else you do in medicine becomes hollow performance, technique without soul, healing without heart? The machines around Harold's bed continued their steady rhythm, displaying numbers and waveforms that told the story of a body trying desperately to survive, fighting battles at the cellular level while completely unaware that the real threat to his continued existence was playing out in administrative offices and doctors' minds. Samuel made his decision not in a moment of dramatic clarity, but in the quiet accumulation of certainty that had been building since Cross first spoke those obscene words. The recognition that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, that there were fates worse than losing a career, and one of them was looking in the mirror and seeing someone who had valued job security over human life. He pulled out his phone and made a call to the surgical team, his voice steady as he confirmed the morning's operation schedule. Harold Peterson, in room 347 at 7 a.m. sharp. All personnel required to be present and prepared. The surgical theatre at dawn possessed a particular quality of light. The sun just beginning to penetrate the eastern windows and mix with the harsh artificial illumination in a way that made everything look simultaneously clinical and holy, a space where the mechanics of medicine intersected with something approaching the sacred. Samuel scrubbed in with his usual methodical precision, but his team noticed something different in his bearing this morning. A kind of calm determination that suggested he had already accepted consequences that the rest of them were only beginning to sense. The surgical nurses exchanged glances as they prepped the instruments, aware that something significant was happening, but not yet understanding its full scope. Harold had been brought down from his room, still unconscious, his body positioned on the table with care, despite the institutional pressure to treat him as disposable. Each member of the medical team reasserting through their actions the principle that this life mattered, regardless of what administrators had decided. Cross arrived just as the anesthesiologist was making final preparations, his expensive shoes clicking against the surgical suite's floors in violation of every protocol about sterile environments. His face flushed with anger that he was attempting to contain beneath a veneer of professional composure. "Dr. Whitaker, step away from that table immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of institutional authority. The assumption that his position gave him ultimate control over what happened in this hospital, regardless of medical judgment or ethical considerations. Samuel did not even look up from his pre-operative check, his hands continuing their steady movement as he reviewed Harold's vitals one final time, his silence more devastating than any verbal response could have been. The surgical team froze, caught between two sources of authority. Their training telling them to follow the doctor's lead, but their job security dependent on not antagonizing the administrator who controlled their employment. "If you proceed with this surgery, you will be terminated immediately," Cross continued, stepping closer to the table, his words now carrying the explicit threat that had been implicit in every previous conversation. "I will personally ensure that your medical license is reviewed, that every hospital in this city knows you defied direct administrative orders, that your career in medicine is effectively finished." Samuel finally looked up, his eyes meeting Cross's across the sterile field. And in that moment, something passed between them that was older than medicine or administration. The eternal confrontation between power that demands obedience and conscience that refuses to comply. The surgical team held their breath, the machines monitoring Harold's vital signs, continuing their steady beeping, the only sound in a room that had become a courtroom, where the verdict would determine far more than one man's employment status. "Mr. Cross, you need to leave this surgical suite immediately," Samuel said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that came not from institutional position, but from absolute moral certainty. The kind of power that needs no title because it derives from alignment between action and principle. "What you are asking me to do violates every oath I took, every principle this hospital was founded on, every reason that medicine exists as a profession rather than just a technical trade. Harold Peterson is my patient. His surgery is medically necessary, and I am going to save his life. You can fire me, you can destroy my career, you can do whatever you believe you need to do, but you cannot make me abandon this human being to ease your donor management problems." The words hung in the air like a judgment, and Cross's face went through a rapid series of expressions as he calculated his options and realized that Samuel had moved beyond the reach of threats, had entered that dangerous territory where a person has already accepted the worst possible consequences and therefore has nothing left to lose. Cross turned and left without another word, his departure feeling less like retreat and more like the gathering of forces for a battle that would be fought through official channels and legal mechanisms, and the surgical team seemed to collectively exhale, their tension releasing now that the immediate confrontation had passed. But Samuel knew this was just the beginning, that the real consequences would arrive after the surgery was complete, that by saving Harold's life, he was ending his career at Memorial General and possibly ending his career in medicine entirely, depending on how vindictive Cross chose to be and how much influence the administrator wielded in the broader medical community. None of that mattered now, though, because Harold's body was failing and time was running out, and the only thing that had any meaning in this moment was the task in front of him. Opening this human being's body, finding the infection and damage that was ending his life, and using every bit of skill and knowledge and experience to repair what could be repaired. The surgery took 3 hours, longer than expected, because the infection had spread further than the initial imaging had shown. But Samuel's hands never wavered, his focus absolute, as he worked to save a life that the institution around him had deemed expendable. His team followed his lead with the kind of precision that comes from years of working together, each person contributing their expertise to the collective effort of pulling Harold back from the edge. And when they finally closed him up and confirmed that his vital signs were stabilizing, there was a moment of pure satisfaction that had nothing to do with career advancement or institutional approval, just the clean, simple knowledge that they had done what they were trained to do, that they had honored their profession's fundamental promise. Samuel pulled off his gloves as Harold was wheeled to recovery and found Cross waiting in the corridor outside the surgical suite with hospital security and a termination letter already prepared. The speed of the bureaucratic response suggesting that every step of this had been planned in advance. That Cross had been ready to execute his threat the moment Samuel's defiance became action rather than just words.